Welcome everyone to this segment. You asked for a wrestling segment, and that's what you're going to get. Not exactly what you thought, but it's what you deserve. We have a guest today, Brian Frick. If you want to introduce yourself properly, go right on ahead.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me on the show. It's your guy, Bully Rye, host of the Tapouts and Touchdowns podcast. You can find me wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, Apple. I do a show that focuses on pro wrestling and pro football / fantasy football. I greatly appreciate you guys having me on the show today, and I'm looking forward to talking to some wrestling with you guys.
Not a problem. We're glad to have you.
Absolutely.
So, I guess the topic that we're going to talk about is the writing of wrestling, the from the Attitude Era, early NWO to now. Does it suck, or is it just me?
Yeah, I mean, if I can start us off here, there's obviously a big difference. So you could even backtrack to even before the Attitude Era or the NWO era in WCW. You can go back to the 70s where it was very, there wasn't a whole lot of gaga with storylines. It was all focused mainly on the wrestling and how it works. And then you go to the 80s where you have these larger than life superstar characters come out. I mean, you think of guys like obviously like Hulk Hogan. You've got Ric Flair and the Four Horsemen down in WCW in the Jim Crockett area. You've got the Ultimate Warrior coming out of the late 80s, early 90s. So a lot of that stuff, it's sort of transitioned from being the sport of pro wrestling into what Vince McMahon would eventually call sports entertainment. So you go from having these larger than life characters to all of a sudden now Eric Bischoff takes over in WCW and decides, you know what, Vince McMahon and WWE or WWF at the time have all these characters. I'm going to make it real or feel as real as possible. So when WCW decided to start doing their realism angles with the NWO and the takeover, then all of a sudden Vince McMahon decided to push the envelope and have things feel more real, but go a little more adult with it. So a lot of the storylines back then, if you actually go back and watch them now, a lot of them are very cringeworthy, specifically with like the sexuality that was brought to the shows, be it with the women that were in the shows. They were sexualized very, very exclusively. The language obviously picked up. So, if you look back on it, I'm not sure if you could say that the writing back then was any better or the producing of matches back then were any better. But I think, at least from my perspective, the realism aspect has come from that NWO Attitude Era full circle back to the character type arcs that they have now, where you've got an Alexa Bliss who's on Monday Night Raw, who has got a gimmick that she has kind of taken over from Bray Wyatt, where she's just this creepy girl that can hypnotize people with her eyes. It's. I mean, you guys can speak on it. Like, I don't know if there's specifically a change in the writing, or if it's just a product of the times.
Yeah, well, there's something that you did mention the sexualization of the women, like the Bischoff era. Whenever he came to the WWE, it was like the first couple weeks was like HLA as all they wanted, hot lesbian action, and then they would be like, "Oh, okay, we're gonna have somebody that pissed me off come over, and we're gonna give them lesbians," and then all of a sudden it'll change to "You've got 3 minutes," and then 3 minute warning would come out, and then before that, just Trish Stratus and how she was made to crawl on all fours and bark like a dog to Vince McMahon, and how whenever Tori Wilson came in, she was on Raw for a little bit, and then went over to SmackDown, and she was on the cover of Playboy. And Eric Bischoff was wanting Lita to be on the cover of Playboy and wanting to see her assets in his hotel room.
Hmm.
So, yeah, that right there. And then, like I said, Alexa Bliss goes over the Fiend, and that whole thing, especially with WrestleMania, I didn't understand it all. It just really didn't make any sense. It's like now you've got Hair and Mandy Rose and Dana Brooke, and then you've got one big person, which is Nia Jax, and you don't really have anybody that can really take her out.
Yeah, I guess we kind of spitball off one another. I haven't been able to watch WWE or New Japan or AEW or anything like that due to my work schedule, but I briefly remember a feud between when Nia Jax was the champion and Alexa Bliss was, I guess, challenging her and trying to be the bad guy. Storytelling wise, logically to me, that doesn't make sense. It doesn't make much sense. Let me put it that way, because usually the bigger person would be the bully compared to the smaller person, and Alexa Bliss, like three of her would equal one of Nia Jax. So it was hard for me to wrap my head around that the writing, the storytelling of how Alexa Bliss was bullying Nia Jax.
Yeah, I think to your point, I think the concept behind that angle had to do with WWE has been trying this anti-bullying campaign for years, even though a lot of their heel work has to do with potentially the bullying from one superstar to another. So when you would typically have like a small, pretty blonde, she's going to make fun of the giant woman, the stereotypical giant woman. Nia Jax is much taller than she is, obviously a much bigger stature than Alexa Bliss is. So I sort of understood the writing behind making Bliss the heel instead of Nia Jax. I mean, to your point, the monsters make for better heels. But at the same time, like, Andre the Giant was a babyface for years before
Right.
the Hulk Hogan angle. The problem you have with heels being the bigger guys is typically in the heel storylines, they're going to have to do something underhanded to go over. So if you have a Nia Jax as a heel against an Alexa Bliss, she's already got the size advantage.
Mhm.
So how can you book that to counter? Like, Nia Jax isn't going to need something underhanded to beat, Alexa Bliss realistically. So it also makes sense from that standpoint that Alexa Bliss is smaller in every way, shape, or form. So she's going to have to pull out all the stops to knock off the babyface Nia Jax. So from the writing standpoint, that's sort of, I think that sort of makes sense. I think to your point, and what we've talked about offline, and what's one of the reasons for me being on the show is that there have been so many opportunities, specifically within WWE, they have missed out because of either poor booking, i.e., poor producer decisions, whatever the case may be, or poor writing. I had a show a few weeks ago where I had about 4 other guys come and do a panel with me, and we talked about all of the releases since the beginning of the year from WWE. And some of those, included Samoa Joe, who's already returned to NXT. You've got, they just had a new slew of releases as early as this past week with Breezango, among others. But one of the names that came up was Bo Dallas. The real life grandson of Blackjack Mulligan, the real life son of Mike Rotunda. Is it Rotunda? Whatever it is. IRS, known in WWE, VK Wall Street, and WCW, and the real life brother of Bray Wyatt. And so the panel that was on my show and I discussed the fact that Bo Dallas was booked as this semi-inspirational speaker who was a bad guy. He had this gimmick where he ran around telling people to Bo leave.
Yeah.
While his brother got over not only in NXT but on the main roster as this sort of cult leader in Bray Wyatt. And so we kind of had this discussion like, well, simply the ball that got dropped by them not somehow manufacturing a storyline where you would incorporate Bo Dallas into storyline with his brother, be it he's taken over as far as this cult following by Bray Wyatt. So Bray Wyatt not only has his family at the time with Luke Harper and Eric Rowan and at one time Braun Strowman, but at some point, like, he can collect followers. Like, he tried to get Randy Orton in the Wyatt family for a while, and they were John Cena, Daniel Bryan. I think the logical right answer would have been to somehow incorporate Bo Dallas and somehow manufacture and bring it in the storyline, the real life brotherhood that they shared. And so specifically when it came time to Bray Wyatt goes away from injury and comes back as the Firefly Funhouse Bray Wyatt with a schizophrenic personality where his other personality is the Fiend, you could have used Bo Dallas in one of two ways. He could have been the host of the Firefly Funhouse as the kid-friendly version of the Wyatts, or he could have been the one that came out in the mask as the Fiend, so that when people thought, well, no, Bray Wyatt is both of these guys, and all of a sudden you get that dynamic where, if you remember the early 90s, there was an Undertaker versus Undertaker match. WCW had a Sting versus Sting around the time when the NWO storyline was putting Sting in the NWO, and in fact, it was an imposter, which would lead to Crow Sting, et cetera, et cetera. So all of a sudden, now you've got potentially Firefly Funhouse Bray Wyatt in the ring. Everybody knows that he's the Fiend, and then all of a sudden, here comes the actual Fiend, mask, outfit, and everything. You could have played that off and wait, this guy is that guy. How has this not worked? And so the idea that the writing has made that shift from the 80s larger-than-life characters to the realism in the 90s to now just storylines being able to write for themselves, write themselves into TV and into the pay-per-views, and for whatever reason, they're just missing the boat. I mean, do you guys agree? What do you guys feel about it? Am I onto something, or you disagree with what I'm saying?
Yeah, they were missing the boat on a lot. There's a bunch of stuff that just kind of should be bigger than it is, and then you get all this build up to a pay-per-view, and then it just falls flat. Just like you said, you were talking about the bullying. So you had Braun Strowman on Raw, and he was getting called out by Shane McMahon all of a sudden. Why would that was kind of ridiculous. And then he's calling Braun stupid and everything and making fun of him. And then Braun Strowman's like, this is for everybody that's getting bullied. And this is just out of nowhere. Nobody was talking about bullying and stuff. And then he's like, this is for everybody that's ever been bullied. And I'm going to put Shane in a steel cage and I'm going to tear him to pieces. And I mean, it was a good match for some parts of it. But I mean, it's as soon as it was over, the feud was over. And it was kind of where did that even come from?
To your point, it was very lazy writing. It was, we need to get Shane involved into a storyline that we can get him on WrestleMania. And the lazy way to do it was to team him up with Braun Strowman. And I agree with you completely. It was absolutely lazy. Why would you have Shane McMahon bullying a wrestler for simply no reason? And I kind of goes to the point. Derek, I think you were about to say something before I cut you off. I apologize.
Oh no, you're fine. I think this might be just me, but I think there could be a correlation of how wrestling was back in the late 80s, early 90s. Or I'm sorry, the storytelling in the ring, maybe. I'm sorry. I know it's a change of the times. Back in the any Flair match in the 80s, he would work someone would hurt their knee, and he would work on the knee. And,
yeah, the limb targeting, so to speak. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I felt, I guess, the storytelling back then was more, I guess, deliberate. Fast forward to now, as Jim Ross says on his podcast, everybody's got to get their shit in, Conrad. So it's more about, the spots more than the storytelling, in my opinion, unfortunately. And that might just be kind of the sign of the times.
Well, I'm not sure if you guys were following anything in the news this week. There was a writer from Monday Night Raw. Her name was, I hope I'm saying this correctly, Kenneth Mobley or Kenneth Mobley. She went on to a podcast and basically said when she was hired to be a writer on Monday Night Raw that she had no knowledge of the product. I'm going to paraphrase her quotes instead of looking them up. But essentially she said, I know there's a guy named Bobby Lashley, and the group that he's in is something like the Hurt Business, and they come out in suits and like, yeah, I'm cool. I mean, that was essentially her quote. And I think, and there was a big conversation. I'm in a Facebook wrestling group called Suplex City that I help co-run with the founder of it. His name is Will Smith, affectionately known as the Fresh Prince. Not the Will Smith that you would think of, but I digress. There's a lot of discussion had. Should writers with no wrestling background be allowed to come and write a television program or a wrestling program simply, because it's on network television? And Kenneth Mobley was released the same week that this story came out because her ignorance came through, very, very loud and clear. And I think I understand the concept of trying to get some outsiders in to give some new perspective, to maybe create some different sort of storylines that we're not used to seeing. But I think this attributes, or let me rephrase, I think you can attribute some of the poor storyline writing to writers like this who are brought in with no knowledge of what wrestling is, no knowledge of the fan base, and at least no base knowledge of what has been happening prior to even their interview. Because then all of a sudden you're coming in blind. You're like, okay, so you're telling me this is what's going on, so let's move it this way. I can't speak to again, if we're talking lazy storylines, years ago, it might have been a few years ago now, where Rusev was still in WWE, and they had the angle where he and Lana split up, and she married Bobby Lashley, and again, I think it was Vince McMahon has always had a history of loving like the love triangle storylines, and I feel like this was just extreme. Again, another sign of just lazy writing to try to garner some sort of reaction from the fans. And it leaves a bad taste in people's mouth because, again, we talk about the 80s and 90s. Kayfabe has been long gone for many years.
Yes. The
idea of wrestling these days is to suspend that disbelief. You want to wonder, especially as a grown wrestling fan, how much of this is real and how much of this is storyline, or how much of this is at least believable. I talk a lot when I've got a friend of mine, his name is PJ Steven, goes and reviews all the pay-per-views with me on my podcast. And when we review the matches, a lot of what I have to say is, in each match, what is believable versus what is just thrown in there for theatrical sake. For instance, in your house a few weeks ago, there was a lot of flipping around in and out of the ring that did not lead to moves. It did not lead to escapes from moves or anything like that. It was acrobatics for acrobatics' sake. Now that comes to more of the producing of the matches, but it still goes to the point that you want to be able to believe that motion is intentional to benefit you in the match. So in that same thinking process, you want to believe that what storyline is being presented to you, be it being in the script and the promos or anything else, is at least believable. And I think that's where, and again, I can't speak on New Japan because I'm not as well versed in New Japan. Obviously, in a lot of their talk is in Japanese, so it's going to have a miss in translation. I kind of vaguely follow Impact Wrestling, and same thing with AEW, but specifically in WWE, it's that lack of believability with their storylines that tells me that there's something wrong with the writing in the shows these days versus in the past.
I just think that us three could possibly write better promos. Yeah, I guess that's what we would do. We wouldn't necessarily be the producers, but I mean, we are fans of the business, and we don't know all the inner workings, but we know what we like, what made sense to us, and what could get over with the fans, rather than, like you said, somebody, the writers that are pretty much hired, I guess, out of college, have no product knowledge, and are just thrown in there to write, which I do have to say that probably they should do a little bit of their homework, or do some homework on the product, instead of just saying, okay, well, like you said, Bobby Ashley or Jeff Harvey, I'm being facetious, by the way, like, have some product knowledge, or do some of your homework, do some homework, and then I think you'd be more well versed to write compelling television, compelling promos. Yeah,
I think that at the core, you should at least, like, and again, it can go into any profession. If you go to a job interview, at least with the job that I have now, the first question that got asked in my job interview is, what do you know about our company? So if a writer goes into a programming, an interview about programming that has to do with pro wrestling, and that first question is, what do you know about our company? What do you know about our business? What do you know about our show? If that answer is, I'm sorry, I'm just a writer, I don't know anything about wrestling, I don't watch wrestling, I haven't watched your product, that should be immediate disqualification from getting the job in the first place. So to your point, like, and that was the argument that I made all week before she was let go, is that, like, I don't disagree with having somebody come in from an outside perspective, but you should at least try to familiarize yourself with what is going on prior to at least the job interview, so that you can present some of your ideas in order to get hired.
Yes,
exactly. Because, I mean, we're trying to get the believability. It's just turned out to be like a highlight reel.
Yeah.
Like, this is like a running gag. It's the WWE was embarrassed, and it's like, I watched WrestleMania a lot, and here lately it's just been talking about how stuff is just going downhill. Like, the pay-per-views, as of lately, I started watching it again full time like last year, and I've watched nearly all the pay-per-views. They plainly suck. It's like, why? What's going on?
I wouldn't say that they've all sucked. They've got some bad matches in there. But going back to WrestleMania, because I've reviewed every pay-per-view WWE has put out since WrestleMania, and both nights of the WrestleMania card had some fantastic matches, despite night one having the weather delay. I just published an episode recently where PJ Steven and I reviewed In Your House, and outside of the opening match, the rest of it was very disappointing and lackluster. I looked at I'm not sure if you've seen Hell in a Cell yet. Minus there was one match between Charlotte Flair and Rhea Ripley for the Raw Women's Championship that had a really stupid finish, and we can get on the production of that. But the rest of the wrestling itself has not been bad. It's the situations that they've been put in based on poor writing, and then for whatever reason, and it's mind-boggling to me. And I don't mean to shift focus here from the writing to the producing now, but they've got former wrestlers that are producing these matches, that are pitching to these wrestlers, hey, this is what you should do in the match. Make sure you hit this spot. Make sure you hit that spot. This is going to be the finish. It makes no sense where a championship match, like in the case of Hell in a Cell, that it would end in a disqualification because the champion pulled up the flimsy part of the announce table and smacked the challenger in the head with it. You should never have a championship match like the main event end in a schoolboy roll-up, especially after how absolutely just brutal that match was. I mean, that match was the longest match on the card. It went over 26 minutes. They beat the hell out of each other the entire match, but the finish was just it made no sense. And so not only are they lacking from a writing standpoint to put together one, believable storylines, and two, storylines that will keep people interested, they struggle in creating these matches that have great pageantry and great storytelling, and then completely shit on the audience with the finish. I mean, some of the best compelling storylines right now in WWE are over on SmackDown with the Roman Reigns storyline and the Bloodline. And now that Jimmy Uso is back, how are they going to interact, Jimmy and Jey Uso, and get them back on the same page with Roman? I mean, again, that's good writing, and I think you can attribute that because Paul Heyman is involved. You can contribute that to the fact that Vince McMahon and WWE have been pushing Roman Reigns for years, and now that he came back from the COVID disappearance and came back as a heel, he's doing some of his best work, and his matches lately have been fire. But it's just a matter of, like, once again, Roman Reigns has had some strong finishes. If you go back to the WrestleMania triple threat between Daniel Bryan, and Edge, he stacked Edge and Daniel Bryan on top of each other and got the pin over both of them. Really impressive optic, really impressive showing. The match itself was great and had great action in it for a triple threat match. Even his match on SmackDown where he just knocked off Rey Mysterio and retained his title, it had a really good finish. There was violence and all throughout the match. It was very well put together. But for whatever reason, specifically when you get on these big pay-per-view cards, it just falls flat because, first of all, you've built with some really, really crappy storylines and crappy writing to the storylines and the promos. And then you fall short of the execution in ring. And I don't mean to get on another soapbox or to continue my rant, but one of you mentioned something about the promos. The promos are overly scripted. I mean, it's one of the reasons why wrestlers like to go to AEW, because they can sort of wing it and pitch stuff around. But WWE's promos are so heavily scripted that a lot of the times these guys can't go off script. They can't, what's the word I'm looking for? They can't wing anything. Like back in the 80s and 90s, it was like, hey, you're going to go and you're Ric Flair, you're going to run your mouth about Sting. These are some points that you can touch on and then do the rest of it. And they went out and rolled it off, just like that. And they're not allowed to do that in WWE. And a lot of the times they're rewriting the shows hours before the shows even go on. Yeah. So it's like these poor guys and poor ladies are getting set up for failure in all ways, shapes, and forms. And I mean, I'm not sure how to fix it. I mean, Derek, I know you mentioned that you thought the three of us could get together and put together some compelling storylines and some compelling, scripts and whatnot. But at the end of the day, you've also got to go through. There's one power, one authority in WWE, yep. And if he doesn't like what you have to write or what you have to say, he's going to nix it and do what he wants to. So, and I can't bite the hand that feeds me. Like he's entertained me for going on 20 years now. But at the same time, at some point, like you feel like you'd have to listen to the fans and kind of give them some stuff that they could enjoy that's new and refreshing and not just rehashed. I mean, does that make sense? Do you guys agree with me?
Yeah, I definitely do. Just to move the segment along, I know Kendrick had a couple of points he wanted to hit on real quick, so I'll go ahead and let you do that, Ryan.
Okay, so the writing, I was highly disappointed in the Goldberg versus McIntyre match. It was overhyped. It was a lot of build up, and it was a waste of pay-per-view, honestly. Like they started out not even in the ring. I forgot whoever attacked who before they even got in the ring, and then it was just really slow, and it was kind of like predictable. Kind of like I feel like Goldberg threw that match, and he wasn't on top of his game at all. That's just how I feel about that one. And it was just kind of like, really, this was on a pay-per-view, and it was severely overhyped versus was back in 2003.
Yeah, I was gonna say I obviously didn't see that match either, but just from like a logical standpoint, and I hate to be analytical, logical, Goldberg's like over 50 if I'm not mistaken. Drew McIntyre's around our age. I'm thinking just how he sorry to go back to how he just beat Kevin Owens for the world
Universal Championship.
Championship. I'm like, you just shit all over Kevin Owens for what? For a guy that the big name recognition. I mean, and he had like a short match because he. I'm glad that Goldberg did not beat Drew McIntyre just because that would have pissed me off. Like, the part timer, he's over 50. Wasn't that great as a wrestler to begin with. Now, as like a brute, like how he just destroyed Lesnar and how that match at Survivor Series that one year was written, that was perfect. But I'm like, to me, after a while, that gets old. I just wanted to interject there before you took over, Boy Ryan.
Yeah, so Kendrick, just I just want to make sure I'm understanding. You thought the writing for the match wasn't good, or you thought the booking, like the production of the match wasn't good? Like, were you saying that the build up to the match or the actual match itself?
The actual match itself was kind of, it sucked. I don't
really
care.
So a couple things. One, to Polly's point, the match between Kevin Owens and Goldberg was clearly to set up the third and final match between Goldberg and Lesnar. Goldberg, as you mentioned, is in his 50s. It's hard for you to keep up that physique, and he wanted his son to be able to see him in the ring, and he wanted to sort of make up for the bad taste he left in everybody's mouth when he left wrestling as a whole in the early 2000s when he left WWE. So to your point, like it's crappy that he sort of squashed Kevin Owens in between Royal Rumble and WrestleMania a few years ago. I believe the show was in Orlando that he would lose the Universal Championship to Brock Lesnar. But from a storyline standpoint, it made sense to build. He had just shocked the world and squashed Brock Lesnar. And then they were going to give him the championship because Brock Lesnar was in the storyline plans for the future. Now, as far as his match with Drew McIntyre at the Royal Rumble in 2020, if you go back and look at that match, and it might not have been 2020, it might have been 2021, but because it had to have been this year because it was in the Thunderdome. There was all the screens and stuff up everywhere. If you go back and look at Goldberg, his entrance into that match, he didn't have his regular wrestling attire, and when he worked out and prepared his return a few years ago with the Brock Lesnar storyline, you could tell that he had done a lot to get himself in shape. The Goldberg match with Drew McIntyre was essentially set up to elevate Drew McIntyre to lead up to that eventual championship match with Bobby Lashley, as well as like just him being like a strong champion. Like there's only been, I think, less than 10 people in the history of WWE that have beaten Goldberg. Some of the likes of The Undertaker, Triple H, Booker T. So having Drew McIntyre go over a guy like Goldberg is going to make Drew McIntyre look that much stronger. So from a storyline perspective, it made sense. Although, again, during that build-up, Drew McIntyre got COVID, so you didn't have the proper time to build on TV that little mini rivalry, if you even want to call it that, in order to build up that match at the Royal Rumble. So there's that aspect of it. And then when I mentioned Goldberg showed up for the match, he wasn't the Goldberg we've seen. He was not in the right sort of shape. And I don't think, to your point, Kendrick, I think the limitations to Goldberg's physique and his ability at this age limited his ability to put on a really, truly good match with Drew McIntyre. So we don't know if the people who produced that match wanted to do more and Goldberg just couldn't physically do it. But to your point, when you're trying to put on product that is the best product out there, you want to put your best athletes on the screen in the ring to put on the best match you can. And if Goldberg cannot give you that match, then again, Kendrick, to your point, he shouldn't have been in that match, and that's why the match fell flat. But nevertheless, again, from my perspective, it made sense why they did it. But again, it goes back to poor execution. And, again, it's sort of that unknown if they wanted to do more and they just couldn't because Goldberg was not the Goldberg that we saw jackhammering the Giant in the late 90s. So that's sort of where I come at from that perspective.
Okay.
I was just looking at it as like somebody that, has sent like, oh, cool, this is Goldberg, he's back, he's going to be on a pay-per-view. Like, not focus on storylines or anything, like, as a fan, and they're like, oh, who is this Goldberg? And I heard he was really good back then, and then you watch the pay-per-view as, like, a newcomer, and then you see that, and it's like, oh.
Yeah, to your point, it was a very lazy attempt to get Drew McIntyre over. And that has to do with writing and the people behind the scenes. You're absolutely right from that perspective.
That's what I was looking at more than anything. I was like, okay. But, I mean, I do get it. Somebody wanting to push Drew McIntyre since only a handful of people have put Goldberg over. But, again, I was looking at if I'm a fan and I'm a first-timer, it would kind of been, like, disappointing to me. But, I mean, I try to look at it all from different perspectives.
Yeah. I had a point I wanted to make, but Bully Ry already touched on it with Bray Wyatt and Bo Dallas. But then again, I did message you last night and say I was going to use that, but it was from your show. So
I apologize for overstepping. That is entirely my apologies.
No, that's fine. I guess really the only other point I had written down, I did a little bit of research. Well, I didn't do enough research. Was I remember either seeing on WrestleMania or Cultaholic or What Culture, Stephanie McMahon had made a talent, or I guess the talent went off script, and she made that certain talent go and apologize to every single writer. I don't remember who it was. Maybe one of you two remember who it was, but to me, that was just like, that kind of goes back to your point, like how everything is over scripted, and if you go off script, you have to go apologize to the writers because they spent all that time, writing your promo, and you didn't do it exactly like they had it written down, so you have to, apologize to them. To me, that's kind of mind blowing, but and not in a good way, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that situation. I know. The only thing I remember her making an apology for anything was when Mickie James was released earlier this year, and an employee sent her belongings back to her in a trash bag. But no, I'll have to do some research because I'm curious to see what talent was forced to go and apologize to the writing staff for going off script. That's actually.
I want to say that was 2, 3, 4 years ago that I heard that happened. So it wasn't recently.
I'll have to look into it. It might be something I can come back and talk to you about on this show, or maybe you guys can come on my show and we can talk about it. So either way, I'm gonna look it up and research it.
All right, sounds good. Yeah, I couldn't think of who it was. I saw something like Chippers or something, but it turned out to be that was a writer or a doctor, or maybe it was just somebody that was posting about it on a website. But the trash bag gate is the only thing that I could find.
Yeah, same here.
Now, it might have been, you might be referring to when Dusty Rhodes went off script back in 2013. I just found an article on Bleacher Report that, if you give me a second, according to Dave Meltzer and the Wrestling Observer, there was a scripted moment that was switched during a nose-to-nose confrontation between Dusty and Triple H. The article reads, for those who watched Raw, the American Dream decided to improvise by putting his left hand in the face of Stephanie McMahon, a third-party observer, while he was making his point to her husband. This immediately prompted Stephanie McMahon to slap Dusty's hand in a moment of primal instinct. So that may be what you're referring to, but that's the first thing that I could see, and that was back in 2013. So
longer than what I thought originally.
Yeah. So.
Okay. Kendrick, do you have any other points? Because like I said, Bully Rod took my only other.
Dude, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to do that. That's my bad completely.
That's fine.
Well, not really points or anything, but there's like a couple things that I want to hit on, like differences between now and then. I get COVID and you're in the Thunderdome. Hopefully they go back to the full entrances whenever they start doing live tours. Like the disappearances of wrestlers, like where's Keith Lee? What's going on with him? Where's Bray Wyatt? What happened? The whole Alexa Bliss Fiend thing at that one pay-per-view. I didn't understand it, but he's not been there. And then the women's Hell in a Cell matches, they have been spectacular in my book. Especially Bayley and Sasha Banks. That was just, great.
If you haven't checked out Hell in a Cell 2021, the Bianca Belair Bayley match might top that first Hell in a Cell match. It was, if not the best match on the card, the second best match on that card. It was a phenomenal match between Bayley and Bianca Belair.
I've got to watch it because I think I stopped watching it before that match. There was just something that kind of aggravated me. I don't remember what it was, but I just kind of quit watching the whole pay-per-view altogether.
Well, I think to your point is, again, I don't mean to overstep, but you asked where Keith Lee was and where Bray Wyatt was. So to sort of, I guess, put it in perspective, right now, Keith Lee has put a couple of cryptic tweets out there that he wanted to let the fans know what was going on. And then as early as this past week, there was a report that there was a dispute in his naming rights with WWE, which would lead me to believe that he is about to be another one of those superstars that are going to be on the release list that has drawn almost 30 names at this point. And then when it comes to Bray Wyatt, my understanding is not in real life, has not been in a good mental state since the death of Brody Lee / Luke Harper. And so that might be a contributing factor to where he has been written off of TV, but that'll be, it'll be interesting to see how he comes back and how they can package him, especially to sort of get his revenge on Alexa Bliss. And again, if you talk about non-lazy writing, it'd be a perfect opportunity to get Bray Wyatt to somehow summon a Sister Abigail and let somebody come in and play Sister Abigail to feud with Alexa Bliss. So, there's that.
Which we will definitely not get because that's how WWE does. I mean, to us that makes sense, but to WWE, it's, I don't know.
It's the old adage. If it makes sense, they probably won't do it.
Right.
That's all that I really had written down.
Yeah, that's really all I had too. I know this segment went a little bit longer than most of our normal segments. We apologize for that. I'm sorry, Bully Rod. I know your segments, they go along because you got the podcast. But for our listeners, hopefully you enjoyed it. Yeah, because most of our segments are like maybe 10, 15 minutes because we try to keep it about an hour or so. But if this happens to go long for the show, so be it. I really had a very good time discussing and hearing everyone's viewpoints on this topic. So it was very refreshing.
Yeah, it was. And I really appreciate you for reaching out to Derek and letting us be able to talk with you. And it would be a pleasure to be on your podcast as well, too. So, yeah, we're always looking for subscribers and other people to chat with.
No, I really appreciate the opportunity to be on your show. I'm sorry that I tend to get long-winded, and I've been actually trying to do a better job myself of making some of my segments on my show a little shorter. So I apologize for coming on your show and being long-winded. But I'll definitely have you on my show at some point in the very near future. We can talk wrestling. If you want to talk about football, we can talk about that. But yeah, I greatly appreciate you allowing me to be on your show, and you guys will be on Tapouts and Touchdowns at some point very, very soon.
Cool.
Well, if that's the case, I'm gonna need to brush up on my NFL knowledge. And just real quick for everyone on here, if you may or may not be a football fan, last year when, and this is just gonna be random, when Tom Brady and the Buccaneers lost to the Saints twice, I'm thinking, oh well, I don't really foresee this going over well. And then he ends up winning the damn Super Bowl. That's just my plug of football for this show. So I'm like, well, I guess anything's possible.
I'm not really that much of a football person, so I don't really have anything to go on.
Well, nevertheless, we'll get you in. We'll talk some wrestling. We'll have a good time.
All right. And as always, I am Ryan, and please like and subscribe. And if you don't, then we'll send little elves to come and chop off your toes.
You always use that line. All right, we'll catch you later.